to go. Tom, of course, the scheme I suggested is very free, so whatever you wish is very welcome.
Good, good. No problem.
Dear colleagues, I'm Filippo Crea, Editor-in-Chief of the European Heart Journal. Welcome to our monthly dialogue, this Socratic conversation among editors, authors, and cardiologists and readers. As you know, the dialogue is live streamed in YouTube and is free. And importantly, you can ask questions. Please ask your questions and we will answer. Well, it is now my privilege to introduce our guest today. He's an important guest. Is Tom Lüscher, my successful predecessor as editor-in-chief of the European Heart Journal, and now Tom is senior editor of the journal. Tom, welcome. The title today of the dialogue is Past, Present, and Future of the European Heart Journal. What else? This is the title. And let's start with, Tom, with a personal question. You are one of the most famous cardiologists in the world, and I'm sure that our colleagues are curious about your life and your history, your personal history. For instance, I noted going through your CV that your initial interest was in hypertension. Was this your initial trigger for cardiovascular medicine? How this started?
Well, thank you very much, Filippo, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Well, you know, I have grown up in a physician's family, and when I was a medical student, I substituted my father when he was on holidays in his surgery, and many patients had hypertension. In fact, that was something that I could handle easily. And as it happened, when I got my first fellowship, I got into contact with Willy Vetter at the time, who was running hypertension in the University Hospital Zurich. And so that's how it happened. And of course, this was such a, at the time, hypertension was really center stage. You know, these were the days when new drugs came in, like calcium antagonists, and then later ACE inhibitors and so forth. So these were the golden days of hypertension. Today is more something that we all do in clinical practice, but of course innovation has become less in this field. So eventually I broadened up to other aspects.
Well, indeed. And I come to my second question. Your contribution to the history of medicine, of cardiovascular medicine, has been outstanding. What do you think has been your major contribution to cardiovascular medicine?
Well, let me tell you a story how I got into the field that was my main interest over decades. And when I finished my fellowship, by tradition in Switzerland, they told you have to go to the United States to become something. And so I decided to take a round flight tickets, and I visited lots of people in the US, Edgar Haber and others, and eventually also passed by at the Mayo Clinic. And then they told me there's a new guy there from Belgium that is very interested in the endothelium. And so I met him over a coffee, and he was such an unusual person as a professor, you know, coming from a Germanic background. He was very relaxed and very good sense of humor. So I said, I'm joining his group, and this was Paul Van Hout. And at that time, of course, again, these were the golden days of endothelium. You know, we had meetings with Robert Furchtgott, with Salvador Mancada, with Louis Ignaro, all these guys that later got the Nobel Prize. And so I was really, pleased to have met these people and got involved into this field that was completely new and fascinating, because it seemed to be important in many fields of cardiovascular medicine. And so I guess my main contribution was to look at what endothelial cells do when they are exposed to hypertension, to lipids and so forth, and what treatment you could use to improve it. So, and this has been, my major interest really over decades, and was really fascinating times. Yes, indeed.
Tom, the next question is, what has been the more difficult moment in your scientific career? I ask this question frequently to our guests for our younger colleagues, because we know that it is a difficult career, and even leaders in cardiology like you sometimes have difficult moments. So this is normal, it's physiological. So our younger colleagues have to learn that sometimes times are difficult. So what about you? What has been the most difficult time in your life?
Well, a very difficult situation. Of course, there are a couple, there are many, I would say, but it's the minority still. But one of the very difficult ones was when I was running a big trial where we looked at endothelial function in patients with coronary artery disease in the CAS lab. We were infusing acetylcholine, and we're randomizing patients to a statin and a calcium antagonist or their combination to see whether we can improve endothelial function. And at the time, this was a statin that was very potent. Cerevastatin was its name, and unfortunately, it had an interaction with gemfibrozil or fibrates. And so we had maybe 30 centers that were participating. So we informed them all that there were some cases of rhabdomyolysis in the US mainly, if I remember well. And so at that point, we had to basically stop the trial. And I was thinking on how to save it, because I still felt that this is something new at the time, and it was in the coronary arteries where really the action was, and where the disease developed. And so eventually we managed to rearrange the trial and focus primarily on the calcium antagonist only, and stop the statin. But this was very, very difficult with all the agencies that are involved these days. But eventually we managed, and we published it with great difficulties because of this change, as you can imagine, eventually. And we're able to recruit 700 patients, and we're able to show that calcium antagonists indeed improve function of the endothelium. It didn't affect the structure of the coronary arteries that were assessed with intravascular ultrasound at that time. So in drug development, you can face really crises that are ethically very challenging, and of course scientifically alike.
Tom, you are very young, and this is the question I always ask my young colleagues. What do you have in your pipeline?
Yes, yes. I have a favorite project, and I would label it under the term resilience. So for many years, since Framingham, in fact, immediately after the war, we learned that risk factors affect our blood vessels, the endothelium, but also plaque development, atherosclerosis, and eventually myocardial infarction and stroke. But what I was fascinated for many years, when I read a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine by Floyd Loop, and he was using the internal mammary artery in patients that had 3-vessel disease. And I couldn't believe it, that you can use a blood vessel that is completely normal as a bypass graft in patients that have severe atherosclerosis. So we did some studies on this blood vessel and showed that it has great endothelial function. We published it also in the New England Journal. And for many years, we were looking at why is the mammary artery resilient to atherosclerosis. And now, because molecular biology has really developed so dramatically, we took this concept up again, and with a young fellow from Austria, a great fellow that I have now at the Center for Molecular Cardiology in Zurich, we sequenced the mammary artery and the coronary artery, and thanks to advice from Peter Libby, we have now also had the chance to talk to bioinformatic people at Harvard Medical School to get more insights on what genes are over or underexpressed in the mammary artery compared to the coronary artery. So I think that this is just flipping the coin from injury by hypertension, lipids, you name it, diabetes, to resilience. And I was very fascinated, also by a lady that her name is Jean Calment. It's the longest living human being so far. She died with 122 and 143 days, and she was smoking until 117. Not that I want to promote smoking, but what's fascinating is that somebody can live with such a vice for that long. So there must be protective genes that are very important and so far under-investigated. And so this is really what's fascinating me at this point in time.
Well, it is indeed a fascinating story. Well, definitely we cannot promote smoking, but perhaps we might promote coffee. Do you drink coffee? Do you like coffee, Thomas?
Yes, of course. I wrote this paper where you made some very tough comments on coffee, that I wasn't nice enough to coffee. But yes, coffee is actually much better than we thought. And in response to your reviewer comments on this viewpoint on wine, chocolate, and coffee that made it even to the front page of some journals in London, like The Guardian and others, is very interesting. And coffee actually is protective, but you have to drink enough. You have to be an Italian that every morning goes per un caffè in the bar, because we actually investigated this, and we found that sympathetic activation that occurs when you drink an espresso, a real espresso, an Italian espresso, not un caffè americano, of course, that when you drink 4 of them a day, that you get down-regulated. You have much less activation of the sympathetic nervous system, while virgin drinkers are the ones that get, of course, tachycardia and stop drinking it, although, as epidemiological studies show, it seems protective. But unfortunately, there was nobody in the placebo group, so we don't know for sure.
Well, another fascinating story. This is a brilliant viewpoint on wine, chocolate, and coffee, published in the European Journal, and really invite you reading and citing this very pleasant and interesting viewpoint. Tom, there are famous colleagues listening to us today. Peter Libby is there. Hi, Peter. And we have a question from David Holmes.
Yes.
Hi, David. Welcome to our.
I know David very well as an old Mayo alumnus. Yeah.
I review his question. It's an interesting question. There is such a vast amount of information and literature which is increasing. How do you manage to keep up, and what strategies could be recommended for others in the field, both those in training and those in practice? Do you have tips for all of us? What are the tricks, Tom?
Well, first of all, you have to be a quick reader. And I think with experience, one gets the point relatively quickly. And I'm sure that you, Filippo, have the same experience. Over time, you see, even if I read an abstract quickly, whether this is something I need to read more in depth. That's of course one point. And then the second is whenever I listen to other people, like when Peter or others give their talks, I make note of what they show in their slides. Because if it made it into a lecture of Filippo, of Peter, of Eugene Brownwald, many others, it must be important, and I'll have a look at it. So that's really how you interact with colleagues that also looked at the literature and give you hints of what is important and what is not.
Thank you, Tom. And now let's come to the European Heart Journal, which is our common passion. The question is, what was your initial motivation when you applied as editor-in-chief of the European Heart Journal? That was more than 10 years ago, but what was the initial motivation?
Well, initially I wasn't sure whether I should do it. And then as we discussed this in the staff that at this time in Zurich, when I was running the Heart Center, my colleagues were very enthusiastic about it, and then I said, "Why not?" And I had, of course, before that experience. Otherwise, I would have never dared to do this, because I had the privilege to work with Joe Lascalzo for many years as Associate Editor Europe, and with Joe I learned a lot about running journals, and also. He had this crazy idea of, at first instance, I thought it's a crazy idea to have specialty journals, more specialty journals. And eventually I said, this man has vision. And that's what I then also used in the European family to really accommodate journals for subspecialties for papers that don't make it to the main journal. So Joe Lascalzo was probably the basis to dare to apply for such a job.
Well, this transatlantic cooperation is always fascinating and productive. Now, I can read another question, interesting question from Peter Lanzer. The question is, compared to the old days, it seems that the quality of reviews in some of the leading cardiology journals is declining. If true, what can be done to improve the quality?
Well, overall, many people criticize the peer review system. And of course, it's not perfect. I always cite Churchill about democracy, It's the worst of all systems, but I don't know any better one. And that applies also for peer review. And I don't have such a negative perception of it. In fact, it is important to have more than 2 reviewers. I think 3 to 4 reviews is useful for an editor, particularly if you're not very much into the very field of a given paper. If you are also working in the same field, maybe 2 maybe suffice. And in principle, we have to consider what actually is the aim of the peer review process. The aim should be to make papers better. And in fact, so often they do this. And I was impressed that the last ESC Congress we had, where we were face-to-face, a young female scientist from the UK came to me and said, "Thank you very much for all the reviews you send me. My paper became much better." And that actually should be the aim. And of course, not every paper makes it to our journal that we discuss here, or some other journals like Jack and Circ that are all first-line journals, but maybe are better suited for other journals. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. They just may be more interesting for specialists. But overall, I think most reviewers make a good job. And I think an editor can judge whether the reviewer really read it and really has good and substantial comments and constructive comments. And I would say that, people that want to kill papers, that often is part of gossip when you have a paper rejected and you're furious about it, is the exception. I think overall, they do a very good job. And don't forget, you know, at one time our chairman of the board of the hospital, a lawyer, came to me, and I presented all the department and the journal, and then he asked me, and so what do you pay for your reviewers? And I said, no, they all do it for free. He couldn't believe it, you know, as a lawyer that's used to billing every minute. And I was very proud that in academia we can still help each other to make papers better for free. This is amazing.
Thank you, Tom. This is an important aspect, and also the burden is increasing because of this proliferation of journals. Yes. Journal fame is fantastic, but the burden on reviewers really keeps increasing. Well, I'm proud to say that next year, starting with next year, our best reviews will receive CME credits. Mm-hmm. This will be definitely possible for European reviewers, but I think also we are working on that for American reviewers. This is done already by Jack. It's really a wonderful initiative, and will manage to give CME credits to our reviews, at least the best reviews. Tom, let's continue with the journal. What has been your main achievement as editor-in-chief of the European Journal, in addition to the spectacular increase of the IF, the impact factor?
Well, you have to ask the audience. But I think, you know, when I took over the journal, I wrote an editorial, "The European Heart Journal Goes Global." And I think that's what I'm most proud of, that I could involve in this journal all my friends from the US that I worked with over years, my friends that have moved to Japan, like Hiro Shimokawa and others, and involve them into the journal, because science is a global adventure for all of us, and you need the best people from all over the world. And I tried also to involve them actively by inviting them for editorials, for review articles. And I think to make the journal global, I think I thought was most important.
Thank you, Tom. I read an interesting positive comments from a colleague, Roberto Carbone. He writes, "I consider the peer reviewers of the European Journal the best in this area." And in fact, the impact factor is improving. So, I mean, very nice comments from.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Roberto, on behalf of both of us. Now, my next question is, this case related to the IF. What are the main reasons for this spectacular increase of the IF for the European Journal in the past few years?
Well, I ask my question, this questions myself, and honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, I just was working on the journal, tried to be fast in decisions, and try to involve the best people, and it sort of happened. So there is not a specific recipe. I think I try to make it interesting, and I think I realized that people don't want just to read about science only. They also want, with a glass of wine or a coffee, read about people. And that's why I introduced CardioPulse, which initially created some unrest about in the presidential trio of the ESC. But I did it anyway, and it became very popular. I think we also want to know about a person, you know, like Mark Pfeffer, Bertram Pitt. How did they develop their career? And of course, if somebody was promoted, I tried to have a little piece on that, and also interesting other topics that are outside science, also ethical questions. You know, we reported from the ESC ethics journals ethics committee that I started, and so on, and so make it more interesting. And eventually also I think the the discussion forum was very popular, that people would like to comment on what they read. Sometimes they don't agree always with what we publish or what our authors publish. Sometimes they want to say, I found the same thing, but they are involved. And I think more and more we should focus on involving our readers, particularly now with all these options we have with the internet and all the social media.
Thank you, Tom. And indeed, CardioPulse has been very successful. Professor Brownwald is, for instance, is a regular reader of CardioPulse.
I know, I had a slide on this. Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, I have another question. I'm receiving many questions, Tom. What we are saying really is generating curiosity in our audience. And the question is, coming back to your career. Your career has been between clinical activity and basic science. Would you advise young clinicians to spend more time in the lab, as you did at Mayo? I think it's an important question. Yes,
I think it's a very important question. I think, first of all, you have to find out what you're interested in, because if you're not interested in, if you're not excited about it, you're not good at it. And I recommend young people to spend 2 years in the lab right after their medical school to get involved into scientific thinking, and then try to get clinical training in a field that really you are interested in. And I had the privilege to receive a career award, where I, after some basic training in internal medicine and cardiology, I could basically do what I wanted, and I could part-time be involved in clinical medicine, particularly cardiology, and part-time in research. And these positions are really very attractive for young people that want to be successful in basic science and in clinical medicine. And I always thought it's very important that people are translational in their daily activity, as you are, Filippo, that in the CAS lab, it's fascinating in the CAS lab. We measured in the CAS lab all the cytokines that Peter found in the mouse at the site of coronary occlusion in patients with acute STEMI. We looked at these cells, and this makes medicine so fascinating that you can help people and at the same time learn from them on how to understand their disease better and eventually, hopefully, also manage their disease better.
Tom, back to the journal. We are moving back and forward from science to the European Heart Journal. We know that COVID is challenging, and it's also challenging for journals. What do you think are the major challenges for a scientific journal in our COVID era?
Yes, I remember when COVID started, I was flooded with manuscripts. And these were probably the most dense weeks of my life, where we received hundreds of manuscripts. And of course, many of those were written very hastily, very quickly. And of course, as an editor, you then are in this two poles between being actual, being interesting, being the first, and yet provide quality to the readers. And this is a real challenge. And as you well know, because we were then together at that year, this was a difficult decision. Often many papers were very interesting, but maybe not perfect, but yet important to learn about the disease that was upcoming. And I think this shows one of the challenges for editors and this goes beyond COVID in my mind. In science, there's also fashion. We had this fashion with stem cells, and some years earlier, we were flooded with papers on stem cells. And of course, I was fascinated myself. We were, in fact, interested in this field ourselves. We did even a Swiss trial on stem cells and infused it in the coronary arteries. But we were maybe too enthusiastic and were accepting papers sometimes with too few N numbers. And I think this shows that as an editor you have to be resistant to fashion and yet try to be actual in time is a real challenge. And this will come again with new things that are in front of our door. But with COVID, this was a real challenge. And now we have a bit more time. We can be more relaxed about it. We can go for more quality. And of course, initially, this was also important ethically to get evidence out to understand this disease that was as important in cardiology as it was in pulmonology, which was fascinating to start with. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Well, usually with the previous dialogues, the editor was the host and the colleague was the guest. Today, we are both host and guest at the same time. Do you have a question for me now?
Yes, of course, Filippo. You know, I was just talking about our other interest, that was acute coronary syndromes. And so tell me, what do you think are your major contributions in understanding acute coronary syndromes that are so close to both of our hearts? Because we were physicians in the cath lab and scientists trying to understand the cellular mechanisms.
Well, I think that the contribution to the study of ischemic heart disease has been to challenge the notion, the paradigm, stenosis is needed to have myocardial ischemia. When I studied medicine a few years ago, in the textbook, 2 or 3 years ago, what I read in the textbooks was, okay, in order to have ischemia, you need a narrowing, you need a stenosis. If there's no stenosis there, you cannot have ischemia. And actually was my mentor, Attilio Massari.
Yes.
Unfortunately passed away a few months ago. The first to challenge this notion. And then it happened when I was a young cardiologist to visit patients reporting the angina. I mean, the angina I could read in textbooks. The angina, the typical angina as a student that was used to read in textbooks. And then coronary angiography didn't show any stenosis, although the description was there. So this generated curiosity. I mean, why this lady, more frequently ladies, why does this lady complain of the angina? I read in textbooks, but the dogma doesn't apply here because the paradigm is you can have ischemia and angina also in the presence of stenosis. And this lady doesn't have any stenosis. And this goes back to what you said before. This is really the charm of clinical research. You start with a clinical observation. You have in front of you a patient who tells you a story you cannot find in textbooks. It's something original. It's not explained by what you read in textbooks. And this generates curiosity, which sometimes brings you to the lab, to the basic lab, and then you find answers which eventually go back to the patient. So I think that in my life, challenging some paradigms has been useful in order to propose new ideas and new pathogenetic mechanisms.
Yeah, another question coming back to journals is, what do you think, where do we end up with journals eventually? I mean, you know, first of all, will we still have printed journals, or will we have platforms with main topics and specialty topics of a big journal family? And how will we still be able to run all our editorial offices at the level of quality with open access coming up in the future?
Well, Tom, I think that open access is a different business model.
Yes.
We will be forced to go for open access, but it's a different business model. What I strongly believe is that in this different model, we must, and we have the capacity to preserve the high scientific qualities of our papers. In order to improve the quality of scientific papers, I think that in addition to open access, which is more for publishers than for editors, I believe, an issue which I find interesting is data sharing. Which means that when you publish a paper, you must make your data on which the paper is based available. I think that the COVID experience is teaching us, think of the no-vax movements, is teaching us that the trust of people in science is not universal. And as editors, we have a commitment. We want to really promote science. And in order to promote science, this science has to be transparent and visible and accessible. And I think that this is something which has been discussed for the last 5 or 6 years, but without finding solutions. I believe that in the future, we should make science more open in order to increase its credibility.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, this would have solved many issues we had with difficult papers where there have been concerns about the data quality, either before publication and sometimes, as you remember well, even after publication. Now, in such a case, we had to invest a lot of time and energy in getting the data set for a re-evaluation independently. Now, if it would have been available by a link or in an archive of the journal itself, it would have been much easier to solve the question. Whenever the discussions come up, then you would have the data, show me the data, and you have it. The concept, of course, can go further. And the question is, what can be done with this data? For instance, in trials, in meta-analysis, we want to use data sets of large registries or trials for meta-analysis. And this is something we actually welcome a lot. And if journals would favor that, this would certainly foster science in many areas. However, there must be rules because for those who have recruited the patients and analyzed the data sets, there needs to be a recognition if somebody else will use these data sets as well for other purposes. But I think this is probably where we will go to in the future.
Well, of course, cannot be the effort of one journal only. It has to be a joint effort among leading journals. And as you say, we need a structure, we need rules. I mean, the authors needs to be preserved. But making science more transparent, I think in the COVID era in particular, is important to convince our citizens that trust in science really improves the quality of our life.
Well, in the times of fake news, that's very, very important. And I think it's also very important that we have ethics committees, as I started it with Martin Simons a decade ago, so that whenever questions come up, we have an independent committee that can reassure people that everything is in order, or if not, can recommend to retract the paper. I think that's very important as well, and I think this was extremely helpful in my career, and I'm sure it will be for you, that we have independent advice and also independent evaluation of any questions that come up.
Tom, let's come back to science. What about the future? As an editor, of course, we want to really publish papers which opens new avenues. What are your feelings about the future of cardiovascular medicine? What do you think are the most appealing fields in which to invest?
Well, I'm very fascinated by the new pharmacotherapy. And with my former associate, Ulf Landmesser, we actually wrote a review about this in the EHJ. And I often lecture about it, and I say it's from herbs to molecules to antibodies and nucleic acids. So when you look at history, you know, starting with William Withering with herbs that were dangerous and toxic because you couldn't have the dose right. Then we had molecules thanks to chemistry. Later on, we had antibodies first for rheumatoid arthritis and other diseases, but then also in cardiovascular medicine for inflammation as well, but also, of course, for PCSK9, as you are well aware of. And then, of course, there has been a Nobel Prize for RNA interference about 10 years ago, or maybe 12. And now already we have the first medication with RNA interference, now particularly focusing the liver, not the heart, unfortunately, because in the liver there are specific receptors that can be easily tagged with an RNA, and then you specifically shut down for prolonged periods of time with the risk complex in the cell, as an example, PCSK9. And antisense oligonucleotides also have a potential in treating conditions such as lipoprotein(a) that we were hardly able to treat a little bit with PCSK9 inhibitors. And I think, you know, these new tools, in my mind, are the fourth chapter of pharmacotherapy. And I'm sure that sooner or later we will also find specific receptors on myocytes, for instance, to treat cardiomyopathies. And I think already there's a potential that for dominant negative mutants of contractile proteins, that we will be able to silence those with RNAs. And so we will move more and more into this area. I think that's really a fascinating door that opens into the future.
Yeah, nucleic acid-based technologies are really fascinating. In the European Heart Journal, we published 2 papers from Thomas Tu on an antagomer, which in heart failure, experimental model and some initial clinical observations, which is very promising. Perhaps, Tom, other areas which might be interesting, for instance, polygenic rescore. I think we need investments in that direction, because you know, with risk factors, we cannot do more than we do.
No.
And the risk factors are important, but when you have all of them, you know that the probability of heart attack will be whatever, 90% or even 100%. But risk factors do not tell you when. This can be at the age of 40 or the age of 90, and this makes a difference. But combining polygenic risk score and risk factors, perhaps really we can markedly improve our ability to predict cardiovascular events, also because genes are there since birth, so you can assess them quickly.
You know, what's very fascinating, there has been a paper in the New England where they looked at this and lifestyle. And if you have a bad polygenic risk score and you behave well by, you know, eating Mediterranean, of course, like you would do in Rome, not smoking, all these good things, drinking coffee, you name it, you can actually get close to somebody that has a low genetic risk score and has no good lifestyle at all. So you can change what, you know, people always perceive genetics as you know, as in the Greek saga, this is fate, you cannot change it. No, you can change it. If you have a risk score for obesity, you can try to avoid it and to avoid diabetes, as an example. If you have a risk score for coronary disease, you can also work on it. And if you have a risk score for colon cancer, you can go to a gastroenterologist every 5 to 10 years and you avoid the cancer. So genes can actually, these risk score can be extremely useful, what you can make out of your disposition by appropriate measures.
Coming to coffee, I've recently learned that coffee went to Naples from Austria, was imported from Austria. So it's an interesting story, from Austria to Naples and now to Switzerland with Nespresso. But it's a fascinating story to tell.
Yeah.
Tom, another interesting perspective for the future is what is personalized medicine. But I think that in cardiology, at least, an initial approximation is what I call stratified medicine. We tend to treat patients with a common phenotype in the same way.
Yes.
A good example is myocardial infarction. With Peter Libby, we wrote a review article on this with this message. The review starts with an observation made by Peter. We still treat patients with MI based on the ECG, which is fantastic, but this is what we've been doing for the last century. It would be better to know the mechanism of myocardial infarction, and we can identify 4 different mechanisms. We can call them endotypes, eventually leading to myocardial infarction. And I think that this is to the phenotype, myocardial infarction. So I think this is another area which we should stimulate, stratification, patient stratification, before reaching really personalization.
I have also, a remark on that, Filippo. When we did our studies in the CAS lab that I mentioned, where we took blood from the site of coronary occlusion and cells and so on, we found exactly the same thing that Giovanni Liuzzo published previously in the periphery, that in fact there are 2 forms of myocardial infarction. The out of the blue guys that have very little inflammation, and the heralded ones that have lots of inflammation. And that's a very interesting topic, and I was really pleased to see that we could find the same thing in different ways and different sites where we had a look at it.
And perhaps in addition to polygenic risk score, stratified medicine, and nucleic acid-based treatment, another fascinating area is artificial intelligence. And here I can read a message from Nico Bruning, who is the editor-in-chief of EHJ Digital Health. And this comment is back to data sharing. I cannot agree more that we need to cooperate and also to make the data available used in publications. In addition, in this era of artificial intelligence, this sharing could also be very good for the AI algorithms. Programs such as publishing data then it goes into details which are too complex for today. But I think this is an interesting message. Data sharing can also allow to build up big data, which are a background for developing good AI models. What are your feelings about artificial intelligence?
No, of course, this is a very important comment we need to share also, because artificial intelligence, once the computer goes for deep medicine, deep learning, then of course it's a bit of a black box for us. By the way, for editors as well. Can I believe what they find? And so what do we ask them then? We ask them to have a confirmation cohort. So when you find an algorithm in cohort A, hopefully a large one, we want another cohort that is as large to confirm this algorithm independently. And for that, collaboration is essential, and access to registries is crucial.
Today we have a stellar audience. There is another question coming from Carlo Patrono. This is a difficult question. So fortunately, he starts by saying Tom, not Filippo, so you will answer. And the question is, Tom, in your editorial experience, is there consistency in conflict of interest rules of different major journals? Should there be consistency in conflict of interest rules among journals and guidelines committee?
Yes, conflict of interest is a very, very difficult topic. And in fact, I wrote an editorial about it because, first of all, I think you can be right with conflicts and you can be wrong without conflicts. Truth in the philosophical sense is independent of conflicts, but of course the interpretation of the findings are prone to conflicts. And also when you are reviewing, then the more conflicts come into play because you may not like what others find. But I would argue that conflicts go far beyond just the financial aspect that we are focusing on. If you send a paper on MRI to a nuclear cardiologist and the guys find that MRI is better than nuclear medicine, it may be a major conflict for this reviewer to be balanced and fair. He may be, but it's a real challenge. So I think to answer what Carlo asked me is, of course, if you have a financial conflict, you cannot review on a drug that you are receiving huge amounts of funding or even honoraria. There you should say, I would refrain from reviewing it. But it should also go beyond that. And as editors, we have to be careful to ask people that are balanced in particular topics. If somebody has worked on his favorite gene or protein and somebody finds that it's completely unimportant in a given disease, this is also a conflict of interest that we have to consider as editors, or also for ourselves when we are asked to review.
Thank you, Tom. It is almost 1 hour that we are debating, really a lively, interesting conversation. I have one final question. I ask all our guests, how can we improve our EHJ dialogues? Do you like this initiative, and how do you think we can improve it?
Is this a question to me, Filippo?
Yes, of course.
Good.
You are the senior editor.
All right. I was thinking, we had such famous guests, and I get also very interested in what young people think about medicine, about the journals, about our Congress, about cardiology. And so why don't you invite trainees once and ask them what they feel is good and bad on what we're doing, and hear what the next generation is thinking about some crucial issues. That would be my suggestion.
Brilliant, Tom. Definitely interesting suggestions, and we will work on that. Well, it has been again a pleasant hour. Thank you very much, Tom, for accepting our invitation to our debate. So this concludes our debate today. And I remind our audience that our next debate will be on the last Thursday of January, precisely 27, as usual, at 17 CET. And in the meantime, Tom, we can wish all our friends and colleagues a very happy New Year. COVID is there, but vaccines are doing very, very well. And really, we are confident that science will win this battle, as it happened always before. Thank you again, and happy.
Thank you. Buon anno.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll just let everybody sign off. Thank you, everyone, for joining.